The moment you feel the urge to explain yourself, something has already shifted inside you. It's subtle, almost invisible. You don't notice it at first because it feels reasonable. You want to be understood, you want clarity, you want to correct a misunderstanding. But beneath that impulse is a deeper signal. Emotional dependence has entered the situation. Most people believe attachment looks like neediness. They imagine it as desperation or obvious clinging. In reality, attachment hides inside urgency. It appears as overthinking, replaying conversations, waiting for responses, or feeling unsettled when outcomes are uncertain. It doesn't announce itself. It quietly takes control. This is where emotional weakness begins, not in caring, in needing. The moment you start needing a specific reaction, a specific result, or a specific person to behave a certain way, your clarity disappears. Your nervous system tightens, your thoughts speed up, your inner balance shifts outward. And when that happens, you stop seeing situations clearly. You start interpreting everything through emotional pressure. That pressure changes how you move. You speak differently. You hesitate more. You explain too much. You read into small details. Without realizing it, you begin organizing your behavior around external responses. Most people don't see this happening. They think they're being logical. They tell themselves they're just trying to communicate. But psychologically, they're seeking stability outside themselves. This is the hidden cost of attachment. When your emotional state depends on something external, you give away control. Human beings are extremely sensitive to this shift. They may not consciously identify it, but they feel it. They sense when someone is invested. They detect when someone cares too much. And that changes the dynamic immediately. Not because people are cruel. Because power follows emotional independence. The person who is less attached sees more clearly. They think more calmly. They respond more deliberately. The person who is emotionally invested becomes reactive. Their attention narrows. Their judgment becomes clouded. This is why attachment creates imbalance. The more you want something, the more it owns your inner world. Most emotional suffering comes from this exact pattern. You want someone to choose you. You want a situation to resolve. You want recognition. You want certainty. Each desire seems harmless on its own. But together they build dependence. Dependence doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like waiting for a message. Sometimes it looks like replaying a conversation in your head. Sometimes it looks like explaining yourself one more time, hoping this time they'll understand. But the deeper issue is always the same. You've handed your internal stability to something outside of you. And once that happens, your behavior changes. You start monitoring reactions. You start adjusting your tone. You start filtering your honesty. You become emotionally flexible instead of internally grounded. This is the moment detachment becomes necessary. Not detachment from people, detachment from outcomes. There's a critical difference. Detaching emotionally doesn't mean becoming cold. It means refusing to let external circumstances dictate your inner state. It means learning to sit with uncertainty without needing to fix it immediately. It means allowing things to unfold without gripping them. This is where the mindset shift begins. Instead of asking, "What will they think?" you ask, "Am I acting from clarity?" Instead of asking, "How do I make this work?" you ask, "Am I centered right now?" Instead of chasing resolution, you stabilize yourself first. That stabilization changes everything. You stop rushing to explain. You stop trying to manage perception. You stop emotionally leaning into situations. You begin observing more. You start noticing how often you previously gave away power by needing reassurance. Detachment sharpens awareness. You become less impulsive. You pause before responding. You allow silence to exist. You give people space to reveal themselves instead of filling gaps with emotion. This creates psychological distance, and psychological distance creates strength. Most people fear this distance because they associate it with loss, but in reality it brings clarity. When you're not emotionally entangled, you see behavior for what it is. You recognize patterns instead of excuses. You notice inconsistencies instead of rationalizing them. You stop romanticizing outcomes. You stop negotiating your boundaries internally. You stop sacrificing self-respect for temporary comfort. This is where identity begins to shift. You no longer see yourself as someone who needs to be chosen. You no longer define yourself through reactions. You stop measuring your worth through attention. Instead, you become internally anchored. Your emotional center moves inward. You become someone who doesn't chase validation because you already possess alignment. You don't rush conversations because you're comfortable with silence. You don't cling to people because you trust your own stability. That internal anchoring changes how you carry yourself. Your posture becomes calmer. Your voice steadies. Your eyes stop searching for approval.
People feel this change even when nothing is said.
They sense the absence of urgency. They notice the lack of emotional pressure. They respond differently, not because you demanded respect, but because you're no longer broadcasting dependence.
And slowly, without effort, your identity transforms.
You stop being reactive. You stop being emotionally negotiable. You stop giving away pieces of yourself for certainty.
You become grounded. You become self-directed. You become someone who remains centered regardless of outcome.
And that's when attachment loses its grip, not because you forced it away, but because you no longer built your inner world around things you cannot control. People don't respond to what you say as much as they respond to how you carry yourself. This is one of the quiet truths of human behavior. Words matter, but presence matters more. Long before logic enters the conversation, the nervous system has already made a judgment. It senses stability, urgency, confidence, or uncertainty. And that first impression shapes everything that follows. Most people believe influence comes from persuasion. They think being understood is the same as being respected. So they explain, they clarify, they justify, they try to control perception through language. But perception is not built through arguments. It's built through emotional signals. The hidden rule is simple. People mirror emotional stability. When you're calm, others regulate themselves. When you're centered, others become aware of their own imbalance. When you detach emotionally, the entire dynamic shifts. This is why detachment is so powerful. It removes pressure from the interaction. It creates space. And in that space, behavior changes. You've seen this before. One person enters a room, and nothing obvious happens, yet the energy reorganizes. Conversations slow down. People become more deliberate. There's no announcement, no dominance display. Just a quiet presence that changes the atmosphere. That's perception control, not manipulation. Alignment. Most social hierarchies form this way, silently. The person who appears emotionally independent naturally becomes the reference point. The one who isn't chasing reactions begins setting the tone. The one who doesn't rush to fill silence becomes the center of attention. People don't consciously realize this. They feel it. Attachment, on the other hand, is felt immediately. It shows up as eagerness, as overcommunication, as subtle insecurity. It reveals itself in the way someone waits for approval, adjusts their words, or seeks reassurance. And once that signal is sent, the dynamic tilts. The person who cares less about the outcome almost always controls the direction of the interaction. This isn't cruelty, it's psychology. Emotional investment narrows perception. Emotional detachment expands it. When you're attached, you focus on results. When you're detached, you notice patterns. You observe behavior instead of chasing responses. You stay present instead of projecting into the future. That difference creates leverage, not because you're trying to influence anyone, because you're not being influenced. Most people unknowingly give away power by chasing validation. They want to be liked. They want to be understood. They want confirmation. So they lean into conversations. They explain themselves too quickly. They soften boundaries. They adapt to maintain connection. But connection built on emotional need always weakens position. The moment you stop seeking validation, something interesting happens. Others begin adjusting. They speak more carefully. They pause before making assumptions. They become more aware of how they present themselves. The absence of emotional pressure forces them to self-regulate. This is the psychological leverage point. Detachment removes your emotional availability from the equation, and when that happens, the other person must confront their own energy. Silence becomes louder. Stillness becomes noticeable. Presence becomes heavy. You're no longer participating in emotional bargaining, you're simply present. That presence creates authority, not authority through force, authority through composure.
People often mistake this for confidence, but it's deeper than that. Confidence can be performative.
Detachment cannot. Detachment is felt in the way you don't rush, in how you don't over-explain, in how you allow others to sit with uncertainty. When you stop chasing outcomes, outcomes start reorganizing around you. You stop managing impressions, you stop trying to appear strong, you just are. This shifts how people read you. They begin projecting meaning onto your silence. They wonder what you're thinking. They become curious, they become cautious, not because you intimidated, but because you didn't give them emotional access. Unreadability creates psychological distance, and psychological distance creates respect. This doesn't mean becoming distant or cold. It means becoming internally stable. You can still be warm, you can still listen, you can still care, but you don't let emotional involvement dictate your behavior. You remain grounded regardless of how others show up. This is what changes social dynamics. When you detach, you stop reacting to every stimulus. You stop personalizing behavior. You stop taking emotional responsibility for situations that aren't yours to carry. You become selective with your energy. That selectivity communicates value. People sense when your attention isn't easily earned. They feel when your approval isn't automatic. They recognize when your emotional state isn't available on demand. This changes how they approach you. They become more intentional. They become more respectful. They become more aware, not because you demanded it, because you embodied it. Perception control isn't about controlling people. It's about controlling your internal posture. Once your inner state becomes steady, everything else adjusts naturally. You no longer try to influence conversations. You allow them to unfold. You no longer seek acknowledgement. You operate from alignment. You no longer explain your worth. You let your presence communicate it. Over time, this creates a quiet reputation. People begin to associate you with calm, with clarity, with composure. They feel that interactions with you are different, more grounded, more real. And that perception becomes your greatest asset. Not because you engineered it, because you detached from needing it. That's when social dynamics stop pulling you around. That's when you stop chasing influence. That's when influence begins finding you. Detachment does not happen by accident. It is not something you wake up with one day. It is built slowly and deliberately through discipline. Most people misunderstand discipline. They think it means forcing themselves to act a certain way or suppressing what they feel. But real inner discipline has nothing to do with repression. It is about awareness. It is about noticing what rises inside you and choosing not to be controlled by it. Every moment presents a choice. A thought appears, an emotion follows, an impulse asks for action. Most people obey that impulse without realizing it. They respond immediately. They send the message, they explain themselves, they defend their position, they seek relief from discomfort. And every time they do, they reinforce a pattern. That pattern becomes their identity. Inner discipline interrupts that cycle. It begins when you start noticing the space between stimulus and response. You become aware of the tightness in your chest when something challenges you. You recognize the urge to justify yourself. You feel the desire to escape silence. Instead of reacting, you pause. That pause is everything. Inside it, your power returns. Because once you pause, you are no longer acting from habit. You are acting from choice. Most people never reach this point. Their emotional reflexes run their lives. Their moods dictate their behavior. Their environment controls their internal state. But when you cultivate discipline, you stop outsourcing control to circumstances. You bring it back to yourself. This is where detachment becomes possible, not emotional numbness, emotional regulation. You still feel things. You still register disappointment, frustration, or uncertainty. But you don't let those feelings decide your next move. You don't let discomfort rush you. You don't let pressure speak through you. You remain steady. That steadiness is trained. Discipline teaches you to stay present when your mind wants to flee. It teaches you to remain silent when your ego wants to speak. It teaches you to observe when your instincts want to interfere. At first, this feels unnatural. Your nervous system is used to reacting. It wants resolution. It wants relief. It wants reassurance.
But each time you resist that urge, something shifts.
Your awareness deepens. You begin noticing patterns instead of isolated events. You see how often your reactions were driven by fear of losing control. You recognize how frequently your words were attempts to manage perception. Discipline exposes these habits, and once they are exposed, they lose their power. You start becoming selective with your responses. You stop answering immediately. You stop filling silence. You stop explaining yourself unless clarity is genuinely needed. You allow situations to unfold without rushing to fix them. This creates mental boundaries. You decide what deserves your energy. You choose what enters your emotional space. You stop absorbing every external stimulus. These boundaries protect your clarity. Most people live with porous boundaries. They take on other people's moods. They react to every comment. They allow small disruptions to derail their focus. Their attention is constantly pulled outward. Discipline brings it back inward. You become harder to distract, harder to provoke, harder to emotionally manipulate. Not because you are cold, because you are regulated. This regulation changes how you experience pressure. Challenges no longer overwhelm you. Uncertainty no longer destabilizes you. Silence no longer feels uncomfortable. You become comfortable sitting with tension without needing to release it immediately. That comfort is rare, and it is powerful. It changes how you carry yourself. Your movements slow, your voice steadies, your presence becomes grounded. You stop leaking urgency. Stop broadcasting insecurity through over-communication. People feel this shift even if they can't explain it. Your energy becomes contained. Contained energy creates gravity. Most people waste enormous mental resources on unnecessary reactions. They replay conversations. They imagine outcomes. They worry about perception. They exhaust themselves emotionally. Discipline ends that cycle. You stop chasing closure. You stop seeking constant confirmation. You stop letting temporary feelings dictate permanent behavior. Instead, you operate from intention. You respond instead of react. You choose instead of comply. This is psychological transformation. It doesn't happen in dramatic moments. It happens in small, quiet decisions. In choosing not to send that message. In refusing to defend yourself unnecessarily. In allowing silence to exist. In staying calm when tension arises. Each of these moments strengthens your internal structure. Over time, you become someone who does not depend on external validation. Someone who does not seek emotional reassurance. Someone who does not rush to prove value. Your sense of authority moves inward. You stop asking whether others respect you. You start asking whether you are acting with integrity. That question becomes your compass. Self-respect begins replacing approval-seeking. Emotional consistency replaces impulsiveness. Awareness replaces habit. This is the foundation of detachment, not withdrawing from life. Detaching from emotional dependency. When you master your inner world, situations stop dominating you. People stop pulling you into their emotional storms. Pressure loses its ability to control your behavior. You become centered, not rigid, grounded. And from that center, every decision becomes clearer, every interaction becomes cleaner, every response becomes intentional. This is how inner discipline reshapes identity. You are no longer driven by impulse. You are directed by awareness. You no longer move to escape discomfort. You move from clarity, and with every restrained reaction, every measured response, and every moment of quiet observation, you reinforce the version of yourself that remains steady regardless of circumstances. There comes a point when you stop waiting for permission to feel stable. It doesn't arrive with drama. There's no sudden realization that changes everything in a single moment. Instead, it settles in quietly. You notice that praise doesn't move you the way it used to. Criticism doesn't linger in your mind. Silence no longer feels uncomfortable. You're no longer scanning faces for approval or measuring your worth through reactions. Something inside you has reorganized. Most people live externally. Their emotional state is constantly shaped by what happens around them. A message changes their mood. A tone shift creates anxiety. A lack of response triggers overthinking. They don't realize how much of their identity is built on feedback loops. Quiet authority begins when those loops break. You stop depending on outcomes to feel grounded. You stop needing others to confirm your value. You stop chasing emotional reassurance. Your sense of direction moves inward. This is where real detachment starts to show its effect. You become less reactive to attention, less disturbed by rejection, less interested in explaining yourself. You no longer feel compelled to correct every misunderstanding. You become comfortable being misread. That comfort is power.
Because once you no longer depend on perception, perception begins to change. People feel it in your presence. There's less urgency in how you move, less emotional noise around you.
You don't rush conversations. You don't over-communicate. You don't seek to control impressions. You simply occupy your space with calm. This changes how others interact with you. They slow down. They become more careful with their words. They hesitate before crossing boundaries. Not because you intimidate them, but because your energy signals self-direction. You are no longer emotionally available on demand. You've stopped offering access to your inner state, and that creates psychological distance. Not cold distance, controlled distance.
Psychological distance allows you to see clearly. When you're no longer emotionally invested in managing how people behave,
you start observing instead of reacting. You notice patterns, you recognize motives, you understand dynamics without being absorbed by them.
This is where dangerous intelligence forms. Not intelligence in the sense of knowledge.
Intelligence in the sense of awareness. You become harder to influence because you're no longer emotionally predictable. You become harder to pressure because you don't operate from urgency. You become harder to destabilize because your center isn't outsourced. Stillness becomes your default. Not forced stillness, natural stillness. You don't rush. You don't chase. You don't cling. You speak when necessary. You listen more than you talk. Your energy becomes economical. Most people waste enormous emotional resources on imagined conflicts, unnecessary reactions, and constant validation seeking. They exhaust themselves trying to manage perception. They drain their attention through comparison and overthinking. You move differently. You conserve. You choose. You respond instead of react. Over time, this reshapes how the world meets you. Situations become simpler. Interactions become cleaner. People approach you with more respect because you approach yourself with more respect.
you stop asking for space. You take it.
You stop waiting to be recognized. You operate from alignment. You stop chasing control. You practice restraint. This inner posture creates long-term influence. Not temporary leverage, not situational authority. Sustained presence, the kind that doesn't fade when circumstances change. Because it isn't built on status or opinion. It's built on internal structure. You've trained your nervous system to remain calm under pressure. You've trained your mind to stay clear during uncertainty. You've trained your identity to remain stable when outcomes are unpredictable. That stability becomes your signature. You no longer need to dominate conversations. You no longer need to prove competence. You no longer need to assert superiority. Your presence already communicates self-command. People feel it without you saying anything. They sense your independence. They recognize your composure. They adjust their behavior naturally. Not because you demand respect, because you embody it. This is what happens after you let go. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop emotionally chasing outcomes. You stop allowing circumstances to decide who you are. Instead, you become internally anchored. Your confidence becomes private. Your authority becomes quiet. Your strength becomes invisible but undeniable. And at some point, you realize that becoming emotionally detached was never about becoming ruthless toward others. It was about becoming disciplined with yourself. It was about mastering your reactions, protecting your clarity, and building a calm center that doesn't depend on approval, attention, or control. You don't dominate the world. You master yourself, and everything else slowly reorganizes around that center.